This episode is brought to you by VPP Simplified. Now you can get element by element tracking and guidance for your VPP journey. Every aspect of the VPP requirements in one easy-to-use interactive spreadsheet. It explains every sub-element in detail, contains an easy-to-read stoplight so you can track current status for each sub-element. It provides you with a 3-step verification for completion of each sub-element. There's even a notes section for you to compile language that will eventually be used for your VPP application. It even comes complete with graphs to show current state and track your progress moving forward. Look, achieving VPP star status can be tough, but understanding what it takes to get there can be simplified. This VPP Gap tool will help you do that. Go to vppsimplified.com for more information.
Welcome to the Safety Pro Podcast, where we help you manage workplace safety one episode at a time. And now, your very own Safety Pro, Blaine J. Hoffman.
Welcome to another episode of the Safety Pro Podcast. We are going to try to, once again, cover OSHA record keeping for injuries and illnesses. I've had several episodes in the past and probably will continue to do more because, record keeping can be quite convoluted. There are a lot of specific cases. Folks send me emails, text messages. I see it online in letters of interpretation, of course. Everybody has their own little wrinkle to an injury, and they want some clarification. So there are some general rules that can be applied to all injuries and illnesses to determine whether it's recordable. And in this case, for this episode, what I want to focus on is to determine whether or not it is even work-related. So there are cases of injuries and illnesses that would call into question whether they arise out of the work environment or a work-related activity. So we are going to tackle that very specific area of record keeping. Now, as we know, the language of the Occupational Safety and Health Act limits the recording requirements to injuries or illnesses that are work-related. The Act uses, but does not really define, that actual term, right? Work-related. So OSHA has interpreted in various publications what the Act meant when they say injuries and illnesses are work-related. And that means if events or exposures at work either caused or contributed to the problem. So work-related injuries or illnesses are, one, they occur at the employer's premises on the property, or two, occur off the employer's premises or property when the employee was engaged in a work activity or was present as a condition of employment. Now, what most people would read under the 1904 standard for record keeping for injuries and illnesses is the, quote, work environment, end quote, means the establishment or other locations where one or more employees are working or are present as a condition of their employment. So that's what the standard reads. Furthermore, the work environment includes not only physical locations, but also equipment or materials used by the employee during the course of his or her work. So imagine a contractor who is at work, but not on any property owned by the employer, but another property, but they're using equipment, tools, materials, for hire. So they captured that with this language. Now, work-relatedness, it's presumed for injuries and illnesses resulting from events or exposures that occur in the work environment. So you're going to start with the presumption that somebody is injured or ill and they were at work when it happened. You're automatically going to presume it's work-related, and you can go through a series of questions through an investigation, through some sort of determination that you make as the employer as to whether or not that holds or not, the presumption is true. So we're going to go through how you would determine whether or not an injury or illness is actually work-related. Essentially, there must be a causal connection between the employment and the injury or illness before the case would be considered recordable. There are some exceptions, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the exceptions because they're going to help us better understand what would be recordable, because it's going to put things into context. And I'm going to refer to not the 1904 record-keeping standard. I'm actually going to, recommend you read the preamble to that 29 CFR 1904 record-keeping standard. It gets somewhat technical, but I'm going to break it down for you so you'll have all the information you need. But essentially, if you don't understand what they write in the preamble, this is where OSHA spells out the rationale behind what they wrote in the 1904 standards, the actual regs, right? So when you read the regulation, you might still be scratching your head asking, yeah, but does that really apply? If you understand the language in the preamble, you will get the context, what they meant or what they were trying to achieve by writing that regulation. So I'm going to talk about injuries and illnesses that would not be work-related and why, so that we can better understand this. But before we jump into the topic of work-related injuries and illnesses, I want to stop and take a moment to talk about the official floor tape floor sign company of the Safety Pro podcast, our friends at Mighty Line Floor Tape. Now, Mighty Line knows how important safety is to your organization. You can tell by just looking at the breadth of their product line, right? It covers everything you need to implement a 5S system for the increased productivity of your facility and increased safety of your workers. Here's just one example. Mighty Line Reflective or Glow Tape. It can create a safer warehouse environment or industrial environment. The Glow Center line can be critical during a power outage and help assist in emergency evacuation. You should see this stuff. I'll give you the website here in a moment. But there's also a reflective center line on their floor tape that can make activities like forklift driving even safer. Just listen to some of these other facts about Mighty Line floor tape. Their patented technology makes it more durable than other floor tapes. That's because it's 7 times thicker than others. And the beveled edge increases durability for forklift traffic. The peel and stick adhesive removes easily, and it's all made right here in the USA. Get a free sample of Mighty Line floor tape by going to mightylinetape.com/podcast. Fill out the little form right there on that page. You'll get a free sample. While you're there, you can even check out past episodes of the Safety Pro podcast. Again, get your free sample of Mighty Line floor tape at mightylinetape.com/podcast. So let's go through the exceptions to work-related injuries and illnesses so that we could better understand when they would apply to our cases. So injuries or illnesses, they would not be considered work-related if they involve symptoms that surface at work but result solely from a non-work-related event or exposure that occurred outside the work environment. And the reason why we have this statement is because OSHA's record-keeping system, it was intended only to capture cases that are caused by conditions or exposures arising in the work environment. It is not designed to capture cases that have no relationship with work whatsoever. So for this exception to apply, the work environment cannot have caused, contributed to, or significantly aggravated the injury or illness. Let me give you an example. A diabetic incident that occurs while an employee is working. Because no event or exposure at work contributed in any way to the diabetic incident, the case would not be recordable. And in this exception, it allows the employer to exclude cases where an employee's non-work activities or even conditions are the sole cause of the injury or illness. The work environment did not create the condition in this case, in this example. And the fact that they had an incident related to that pre-existing condition, it just happened to be while they were at work, the employer would not record that if it met any of the other record-keeping criteria, like resulting in medical treatment beyond first aid, work restrictions, things like that. Also, injuries and illnesses would not be considered work-related if they result solely from voluntary participation in a wellness program or in a medical, fitness, or recreational activity like a blood drive, a physical, flu shot, exercise classes, basketball, things like that. Here's why this is important. I see a lot of workplaces have basketball hoops and stuff out back in the parking lot, during breaks. The exception allows employers to exclude certain injury or illness cases that are related to personal medical care, physical fitness activities, voluntary activities, things like that. The key words here are solely and voluntary. So the injury or illness has to be solely related to that voluntary activity. So the work environment, again, in this case, just like the previous one, right? The work environment cannot have contributed to the injury or illness in any way for this exception to apply. Also, in this case, participation in the wellness, fitness, or recreational activities has to be voluntary, not a condition of employment. And the reason is it would allow employers to exclude cases that are related to personal matters, not undertaken as a condition of work. Here's an example. If an office worker was injured while performing some sort of workout class in the company gym that happens to be on site, and this was during his or her lunch, the case would not be work-related. On the other hand, if an employee was assigned to manage the gym or paid to conduct the class as a part of their job and became injured, then it would be work-related because there is a work relationship there. It was a condition of their employment. Similarly, if an employee suffered a severe reaction to a flu shot that was administered as part of a voluntary inoculation program, the case would not be considered work-related. However, if an employee suffered a reaction to medications administered to enable the employee to travel overseas on business or as a condition of employment, that would be considered work-related. So you see the connection there? Solely related to voluntary, non-mandatory activities versus this is something you have to do in order to work. That's the connection. Another example of an exemption here in record keeping would be an injury or illness would not be considered work-related if they are solely the result of an employee eating, drinking, or preparing food or drink for personal consumption. And it doesn't matter if it was bought on the premises or brought in from home. It doesn't matter, or from another store or outside of work. Now, OSHA has gotten many letters on this one asking for interpretations. So they addressed it in this exception to the record-keeping standard. An example would be a case where an employee injures him or herself by choking on a sandwich brought from home but eaten at the employer's establishment. That would not be considered work-related. On the other hand, if the employee was injured by a trip or fall hazard present in the employer's lunchroom, that would be considered work-related because it was the work environment, the immediate environment that contributed to it, and they were there as a result of being at work. So this exception is only if it's a result of eating, drinking, preparing food or drink for personal consumption. Along with that, if an employee becomes ill as a result of ingesting food contaminated by workplace contaminants like lead, or if there's a case of food poisoning from food items that the employer provided, that would be work-related. Another wrinkle here in this case that's worth noting is if an employee contracts food poisoning from a sandwich brought from home or purchased in the company cafeteria, like if there's a vending contractor set up and they're just there for employees to purchase should they wish to, and they get ill and take time off to recover, that is not work-related. On the other hand, get this one. If an employee contracts food poisoning from a meal provided by the employer at like a business meeting or company function and has to take time off to recover, it would be considered work-related. Again, I have to reiterate, food provided or supplied by the employer, it does not include food that the employee voluntarily purchases from the company cafeteria, but it does include food purchased by the employer from the company cafeteria or from another source and brought in for like a business meeting or something like that. So the test is whether the employer is purchasing and providing the food regardless of where it came from, or whether or not employees are voluntarily purchasing it at the cafeteria or bringing it in from home. That's sort of a wrinkle, but that's where you would determine whether it's work-related or not work-related. This one is probably one of the more common ones that I hear about in the workplace, and that is the fact that injuries and illnesses would not be considered work-related if they're solely the result of employees doing personal tasks unrelated to their employment at the establishment outside of their assigned working hours. This one is key, assigned working hours. Again, another one that OSHA gets letters on all the time over the years, right? It allows employers limited flexibility to exclude from the record-keeping system situations where an employee is using the employer's establishment for purely personal reasons during his or her off-shift time. Here's an example. If an employee were using a meeting room at the employer's establishment, but it was outside of his or her assigned working hours to hold a meeting for a civic group to which he or she belongs, right? And slipped and fell in the hallway, the injury would not be considered work-related. On the other hand, if the employee were at the employer's establishment outside his or her assigned working hours to attend a company business meeting or a company training session, that slip or fall would be work-related. It has to be something that is voluntary or outside their normal job. It cannot be anything related to working for or a task performed on behalf of the company. Here's another good one. Injuries and illnesses would not be considered work-related if they are solely the result of personal grooming, self-medication for a non-work-related condition, or are intentionally self-inflicted. This exemption, it allows the employer to exclude from the log any case related to like personal hygiene, self-administered medications. What comes to mind is like insulin. If there's a reaction, it goes back to one of the first examples, that if you have an incident related to a condition that had nothing to do with the workplace, or even intentional self-inflicted injuries. And it's unfortunate, but you'll hear these from time to time, attempted suicides. If it just so happens it was in the work parking lot in a vehicle, when somebody arrived, or right when somebody ended work, or on the premises somewhere. So here's an example. Let's say there's a burn injury from a hair dryer used at work to dry the employee's hair. That would not be work-related. Similarly, a negative reaction to a medication brought from home to treat a non-work condition would not be considered work-related, even though it first manifested at work. That's key. Some people will say, I'm not feeling well, and maybe they're working with some chemicals or some materials that you would suspect could cause dizziness, lightheaded, nausea, things like that. It can get a little sensitive. This is why having somebody on site that can ask these questions of, are you taking any medication that we should be aware of that has adverse side effects, things like that. The employer is required, in any of these cases, by the way, the employer is required to make this determination. Is it more likely than not to be not related to work activities, right? That to be able to use any of these exceptions. But by going through these, we can understand better when something would be work-related using these examples. Another popular one, there's a couple of them here that are like the most common ones. If you're listening, you're probably like, yep, I've had that one before. I've heard of that one before. I've dealt with one of these. An injury or illness, mostly injuries in this case, right, would not be considered work-related if they're caused by motor vehicle accidents occurring in the company parking lot or on company access roads while employees are commuting to or from work. That is important. While they are commuting to and from work. This one's going to get a little, people get all hot and bothered about this one, and I always get emails and get messages about this one, but it's clear, okay? So I'm going to talk about it. This exception allows the employer to exclude cases where an employee is injured in a motor vehicle accident while commuting. And here's an example. If an employee was injured in a car accident while arriving at work or while leaving the company's property at the end of the day, or while driving on his or her lunch hour to run an errand, the case would not be considered work-related. On the other hand, If an employee was injured in a car accident while leaving the property to purchase supplies for the employer, the case would be work-related. This exception, it represents a change from the previous position that OSHA took in some of the older record-keeping rules, if some of us that remember that, right, that we operated under this presumption all the time, and that was that no injury or illness occurring in a company parking lot was considered work-related. This changes now based on whether or not you were doing something for work. So here's a real-world example. If you have multiple physical locations, it's an industrial environment, and you go from plant A to plant B, and you have to get in your vehicle to drive over there for a meeting, that's work-related activity. So if you have, we call transient employees, right, that go from plant to plant to go to different meetings, to go deliver materials, they're in their personal vehicle, that's work-related if there's an accident, an injury resulting from that. So OSHA has concluded some injuries and illnesses that occur in company parking lots are clearly caused by working condition or activities. Being struck by a car while painting parking lot space indicators. Another example, slipping on ice that is permitted to accumulate in the lot by the employer. That's the presumption, right? By their nature, they point to conditions that could have been corrected or improved. So that's why you're going to catch some of these cases when somebody's coming to work, gets out of their vehicle, slips and falls, that's on the property. It's considered work-related. If they're in a motor vehicle accident while coming onto or leaving the property, that's an exemption. That it gets weird, but that's the thing you need to ask, right? Were they struck by another vehicle unrelated to work, or were they in the parking lot because they had to be there for work-related activity? This is one of the examples that still people have some gray areas they work in, but that's really all you have to ask. Another one that's typically exempted is, as we know, common cold and flu. OSHA allows the employer to exclude these cases of common cold or flu, even if contracted while the employee is at work. However, there's always a but in here somewhere. In the case of other infectious diseases like TB, hepatitis C, the employers, they have to evaluate reports of these illnesses for work relationship, like helping somebody in a first aid case, or if they're an occupational nurse, you have to make a determination as to whether or not it was contracted at work or likely to have been contracted during the work activities. OSHA also publishes a lot of, Q&As to kind of drive some of this stuff. We're going to go through some Q&As before wrapping this up, and this also will help clarify some of the questions that I continue to get around whether or not this is work-related. Again, we're not addressing whether or not it's a recordable in general, like does this constitute medical treatment or first aid? Is it lost time, restricted or transferred? We're just talking about the work relationship involving some of these cases. So let's go back to personal tasks, because this is a popular one. What are personal tasks for purposes of the exception to what OSHA uses as a geographic presumption? Remember, as soon as it happens and you're on the property, the presumption is it's work-related. You have to then determine whether or not it falls into this exemption of a personal task. These are, again, as I said before, these are tasks unrelated to the employee's job. If an employee uses a company break area to work on their kid's science project, for example, they're engaged in a personal task. Here's where you would not be able to use this exemption. So this is one that I still hear to this day. Somebody's on their lunch break and goes into the cafeteria and a door swings open and hits them in the nose. It's like, wow, they were on break. They were at lunch. That's you can not record that. No, that's not true. So you have to be very, very careful about some of these exemptions. What about if an employee stays at work after normal working hours to prepare for the next day's tasks and is injured? Like an employee stays after work to prepare like an air sampling pump or prepare a presentation and gets injured. Well, remember, a case is work-related anytime an event or exposure in the work environment either causes or contributes to an injury or illness. or significantly aggravates a pre-existing injury or illness. So the work environment includes the entire establishment, the property, and other locations. So if you're doing work-related tasks, and let's say you're not required to stay past 8 hours, but you choose to, and you're doing work, it was on the property. So it's going to get netted into this work-relatedness. It's only if you're doing a personal task. The example on a personal task would be if you choose to stay after work because a second shift employee is coming in, and let's say there's a slight overlap. You're going to wait, or there's no overlap, I should say, and you're going to wait for your friend on second shift to come in, and you're going to go out to the parking lot and you're going to lend him or her, a personal item from home. Let's say you give a buddy a toolbox and you drop it on your foot as you're getting it out of your truck. It is after you have completed your work, so it's after your expected stop time, and it's before the other employee's start time, but it's on the property. It would not be work-related because it was a personal it falls into this personal task. But if you have an employee that decides to go outside during one of the paid breaks or even one of the lunch breaks to do something, it is between your start and stop time, your expected start and your expected stop time, that may be recordable. OSHA has these two conditions that have to apply, right? It has to be outside of your normal start and stop time and a personal task unrelated to work. These exemptions I'm going through are very specific. That is, if you're driving off the property to go get lunch or run an errand and you're in the vehicle or struck by a vehicle, there's a motor vehicle exemption. But if you're walking through the parking lot and you get injured in any other way, shape, or form, even if you're leaving to go to lunch and it's on the property and it's during your expected start and stop time, which includes breaks, formal and informal breaks, then it is work-related. If you're outside your expected start and stop time and it's a personal task you're performing that causes the injury, in the case I gave you, the toolbox caused the injury. That was a personal item. It was a personal task. If you're unloading a toolbox that you brought from another facility to bring into this facility and it's part of work, even if it's before your start time, that could be work-related. Okay, I hope that's clear. I get this question a lot. Remember I talked about pre-existing conditions like medical conditions? The example that I used from OSHA was about a diabetic event. Well, here's one I get a lot about seizures. What if somebody suffers an epileptic seizure, falls down, breaks their arm, but they're at work? Neither the seizure nor the broken arm are recordable. And the reason is because they're solely a result of non-work-related events or exposures. Of course, epileptic seizures are a symptom of a disease of non-occupational origin. The fact that they occurred at work doesn't make it work-related because epileptic seizures are not work-related. Any injury resulting solely from the seizure, such as a broken arm, in this example, that would not be recordable. Another good question is about parking lots in general. How does OSHA define a company parking lot? So parking lots are part of the employer's premises and therefore part of the establishment. They're under the control of the employer, like any parking area where the employer can limit access, or they have to clean, plow, or they actually hold the deed or title to. On the other hand, a parking area where the employer does not have control, such as a parking lot outside of a building shared by different employers, or a public parking area like those found at a mall or beneath a multi-employer office building, would not be considered part of the employer's establishment except for the owner of the building or mall. And therefore, that would not be a company parking lot for the purpose of OSHA record keeping. This is important. If you have a multi-employer commercial office building where there's like 6 different companies on different floors and it's one common shared parking lot, that parking lot is not owned by any individual tenant, and it's a public area that other people come and go. There's a doctor's office, so patients come and go. There's a private investment company where clients come and go. It's a public parking lot, and not one of these tenants really controls it. It's the building owner has a contract to plow it, and we can't really control it as individual tenants. That's not considered the work environment. That one is important. So if you slip and fall out there, not recordable. Alrighty, I mentioned this one earlier, so we're going to talk about it. What about clocking in or clocking off? I'm going to clarify this. Any injury or illness that occurs is considered work-related even if that employee was not officially on the clock for pay purposes. If they were on the property, that's key. And remember, the exception is if it's like at a mall or a shared office building where you don't own or control the parking lot. In general, your parking lot is going to be property. So, for purposes of OSHA record keeping, the injury and illness occurring in the work environment, that's considered work-related. Remember what I said, clocking in and out with a time clock or signing in and out does not affect the outcome for determining work-relatedness. You were there as a condition of your employment on the property, and that was the proximate cause. The work environment was the proximate cause of the injury or illness, slipping on the ice or tripping over a parking block, things like that. Yes, even clumsiness, as some would say, that's on the property. Right, even before you clocked in, you were coming in to clock in. That's on the property, is related to work. Again, I'm going to repeat this one. Unless what caused or contributed to the injury or illness was a personal task prior to the expected start time or after the expected stop time for your shift. If it was a personal task in the parking lot or on the property, unrelated to work. So tripping on the parking block or some loose gravel or a pothole in the parking lot or the ice, that is work-related. Dropping a toolbox you brought from home on your foot because you're moving it from the back seat to the front seat because you're going to go pick your kid up at the daycare and you've already stopped, that's not work-related. Another example of this to drive it home, and I feel like at this point I've belabored the point, but it's important because these questions continue to come up. Another example to drive that last point home is you've clocked out at your expected stop time. You haven't left the building yet, but you go to your locker to get your coat. Shut the door on the locker and pinch your finger in the locker door. Work-related. Do you see the difference there? Because the example was it has to be both before your expected start time and expected stop time and a result of a personal task unrelated to the work environment. So the locker is the work environment. It's provided for you to keep your coat in so you can come into work. So even though you've clocked off, you're collecting your personal items, it was the work locker that contributed to the injury. Just like the parking block or the pothole is the work pothole or work parking block, if that makes sense to you. Okay, so those are all examples of work-relatedness. I wanted to be very specific and targeted with this episode of I only want to address how would we determine if something is work-related. So remember, an employee voluntarily leaving to go get lunch, gets in the vehicle to go get lunch off the property, that's a personal errand. If they're meeting their team for a team lunch meeting somewhere at a restaurant, and it's part of the job, that's a work-related activity. So if you slip and fall at the fast food restaurant during lunch, that's a personal errand. I hope I gave you some real-world examples of what would be considered work-related and not. Smoke breaks are another good example. We get this a lot. Somebody leaves, walks across the street to smoke a cigarette, slips and falls. If it was off the property, that's a personal errand. But if you're on the property and slip and fall, it's between your expected start time and stop time. And even before you clock in or right after you clock out, you're coming or going, it's on the property, it's related to work. This geographic standard litmus test OSHA uses, is it on the company property? That's where we're going to start. If it was, the presumption is it's work-related, and then we can ask some of these other questions. Was it before their start time, and was it a personal task, and did that cause the accident, or was it something in the work environment that caused the accident, tripping, slipping, falling, or does it fit the motor vehicle accident exemption? Was it a motor vehicle accident, another individual not work-related, striking this individual or getting into an accident. So you got to go through these questions. I hope the Q&As that I ran through and the exemptions I ran through clarify this for you. I know, those of us that deal with this all the time, it's pretty clear. Every once in a while we get a head scratcher, but you can figure it out. I'll post these all in the show notes. Go to the website, thesafetypropodcast.com, and you'll see all of these Q&As laid out. You can print them, save them, or use them for reference. But I hope I clarified this. Keep the emails coming. I get a lot of these via email. So when looking at whether or not an injury or illness is first work-related, go through some of this information and call upon these Q&As to help you determine whether it's work-related. Again, I'd like to thank Mighty Line Floor Tape. Go to mightylinetape.com/podcast to learn more about their products and services. That wraps it up for me. And until the next episode, please be safe.